Good morning. It is a good morning, but also a very special one. Do you know why? This morning is the last time that we are gathering completely virtually, just as Grace Chapel. And think about it. So next week there's a joint service, and the week after that we're coming back in person. And so I actually thought that today would be a good time to look back at how far we've come. Look back at the journey of the last 16 months, because it's been quite the journey. There's actually a journey behind our psalm for this morning. It's Psalm 130. And this is one of the psalms called a Psalm of Ascent. It's a collection of psalms at the back of the book that are kind of like a traveling songbook for pilgrims as they made their way to Jerusalem. So there are 3 major festivals in the calendar year, and you can just imagine that you and your family and perhaps people from your village are traveling together in a caravan up to Jerusalem, and to pass the time and to prepare yourself, you're singing songs. You're singing the songs of ascent. Ascent because you're climbing up towards Jerusalem. It's a city on a hill, right? And so you can imagine that as you sing these songs, they take on new meaning as you begin to see the city for the first time, or actually climb the hill and your legs are getting tired. But the song encourages you to finish the journey well. And pilgrimages, pilgrimages are not just an average trip. They're different from like a tourist trip where you're just trying to see the sights and take pictures and go from one place to another as quickly as possible. Pilgrimages have a special layer of intention to them, of meaning. They're a quest for identity. They're a quest where the journey itself is just as important as the destination. And so as we look at this psalm, imagine yourself being a pilgrim, singing it on your journey. It starts by saying, "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy." I think this psalm is not meant to recall just one person's experience, but it's written in a broad enough way that it can capture all of our experiences, so we can all relate. I mean, when you hear these words, what feelings does it conjure up in you? Out of the depths, you can imagine despair. I cry out to you. One thing this tells me is that suffering is to be set out in the open. So we live in a culture where one of our goals is to be constantly happy, perpetually healthy, and any difficulties are somewhat awkward to bring about. Sometimes it's not socially acceptable to talk about our sufferings, but I think this psalm shows me that we're not meant to tuck them away. It's meant to encourage honesty among us. And the Christian story itself is honest about suffering. At its pinnacle is a story of one man going through unbearable suffering. And as Christian people, I think we have to go there again and again. And not that we have to choose to suffer, but we do have to acknowledge and embrace that life does contain suffering and process what that means for us. Just 2 weeks ago, Ross did bring up the residential school discovery of the unmarked graves in BC. And it's worth noting that this has happened again, not altogether surprising, but I think part of putting suffering out in the open is acknowledging these tragedies. We can't move on as if nothing has changed. We can't forget. And in fact, one of the real barometers of how well as a society we're processing this is, are we still talking about it in a couple weeks or a month? The Psalms often do start with despair, but then they move slowly to hope. In the next verses, 3 and 4, it says, "If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can, with reverence, serve you." The psalm starts with a recognition of our faults. These verses do. They recognize that we're not just the ones receiving the suffering, as seems to be the case at the beginning of the song, but often we're the ones causing the suffering, to ourselves or to other people. We need to be honest about this state of ourselves. And yet I love the word if that the psalm begins with. If you, Lord, kept a record of wrongs. I think it says if because this is simply not the state of God. God does not keep record of our wrongs. He doesn't hold our sins above us. If is a powerful word, then but is an even more powerful word. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness. Assi and I are reading this book by Henry Nouwen called In the Name of Jesus. And in that book, he talks about our second love versus God's first love. Our second love is the love that we receive from the people around us, our family, our friends, our community. And with that love, there's always a chance of rejection. There's always a chance that our love will be unrequited. And we tend to think of that second love and transfer those properties onto the first love of God. And sometimes we're afraid that, well, this too is true of God's love, that there is a chance of rejection. But Nouwen says that in the first love is offered to us by a God in whom there are no shadows. The love is truly unconditional. And actually, this past week, I've had one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. About a week ago, I was contacted at 10 o'clock at night by someone who I did not know, only peripherally. I'd only had to email them one or two times for something. And they were in a spiritual pickle, they called it, and looking for some assistance or some guidance. And they've made their way through that with a remarkable amount of grace and maturity, actually. But just yesterday, as they were sitting in the Tim Hortons drive-thru, they tell me, they were suddenly moved by a strong feeling of God's love. They realized that unconditional love is something that they've been searching for their whole life and have yet to receive from family, friends, or really anywhere. But that, and I quote, unconditional love was Jesus' whole thing. And in fact, it's God's love that really fills the hole in our heart. So if they're listening, they know who they are, but I just want to affirm that really was God speaking to you. Over time, and with much healing, we do get to know God and his character. We get to know his love for us, even if it's not the love that we've experienced from other humans. This love leads to trust, and I say it like this: love leads to trust, leads to love. So our response to trusting God is to love and serve him, love by loving our neighbor. And those two verses, 3 and 4, are kind of a summary of Christian maturity and discipleship. God offers us forgiveness, and we respond in love. But the psalm then fleshes out what it really means to serve, and it does it in an unusual and surprising way. Verses 5 and 6, I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning. So how are these verses about waiting a development of the last two, which is about serving God? Is it possible that by serving God we are waiting, or by waiting we are serving God? You know, the person who wrote this, what are they waiting for? A pilgrim traveling on the road, what are they waiting for? Perhaps it's a festival. Perhaps they have a certain biblical story that they're reenacting in their mind, a certain renewal of their identity that they're seeking out, a reminder of who they are as a people. What are they waiting for as they travel? Look at the imagery in those verses. Something about a watchman waiting for the morning. Now, what do you imagine there? Do you imagine someone at the top of a castle looking over, watching for an enemy? Do you imagine some kind of sentry at the city gates looking for the break of dawn? You know, it's a really interesting metaphor because while watchmen do certainly wait, and it says it twice just to emphasize the waiting part of it, they also know with certainty that the morning is coming. I mean, there's no doubt in their mind that the morning will or will not come. And what does this mean for our relationship with God, for when we wait with God, which apparently is waiting even more than a watchman waits for the morning? What are we waiting for God to do? We're waiting for him perhaps to bring redemption, for him to make all things well, for him to gather all things up to himself, to bring his new creation, to make a new heavens and a new earth. And while we do wait eagerly for that, we also can live lives that bring that about ourselves. I'm reminded of the certainty in another psalm that says, "Weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning." There's a certainty to it. It's not a blind belief that things will get better necessarily in our life, but it is a conviction that God is moving the universe into a place of reconciliation, and we can lean into that ourselves. In these verses, number 5 and 6, they talk about waiting with your whole being. And I think it's true that waiting is a conviction of your whole being. It's not a passive thing. It's not like being in line at the bank or waiting for your Netflix account to load. It's a very active thing. It involves your mental faculties, your physical, emotional, spiritual. If all of you desires this thing, then you are leaning into this hope, this possibility. It's what you live for. Eugene Peterson, says that waiting for God is actually going about our tasks, confident that God will provide the meaning. And we don't always see the point of our actions, or even of loving our neighbor, or of investing in certain relationships. But the truth is that love is not a black hole. It's not meaningless. The love doesn't go out into the universe and disappear, you might say. Every small act of love is meaningful. It's building God's kingdom. It has eternal consequences. And no matter if we understand that here and now or not, we can go about our tasks confident that the meaning comes from God. And that's kind of what it means to wait. I mean, I think of 1 Corinthians 15. And that's a chapter all about the resurrection, the hope that we will be resurrected. There will be new bodies, a new creation. And at the very end of that chapter, it doesn't say, and so now you can just wait for things to get better because it's only a matter of time. Well, actually, it says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." It's not meaningless. It's actually creating a future. If you're a Malagash person, then you know that is actually the official verse of Malagash Bible Camp. Now, waiting is actually not so abstract a concept as we might think. In fact, our whole world has been waiting for something, hasn't it? At first, we were waiting for the case counts to go down. Then we were waiting for a vaccine to be developed and to be rolled out. And now that that's here, we're waiting for the Holy Grail. Normalcy, right? That's the word. These are our new idols. These are the things that we put all of our hopes and put all of our stock into. And it's not bad to be hoping for these things, but we do have to realize, and I think we have realized it, that these things are very liable to disappointment. In fact, I think our yearning for normalcy is really a yearning for things to be made right. Not just for things to be made right again, but for God to bring justice, beauty, and reconciliation to the universe. Our yearning for normalcy is actually a shadow of a deeper yearning. And that's where the psalm is going to end. Verses 7 and 8. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. I mean, there's a lot here, but one of the things this reminds me of is that suffering is never ultimate. At the end of the day, at the end of time, it's not our suffering that ultimately defines us. I mean, remember where this psalmist started, in the depths of despair, but this is where they end. Believing, or at least trying to believe, in full redemption. That's actually why we, as individuals, as a church, as a community, that's why we can face suffering. Because it never constitutes the bottom line. So the bottom has a bottom, but the heights are boundless, you might say. We're called to fix our attention on God's ways of grace, on resurrection, knowing that there is a future, and that future starts now. This redemption, this story, it's the story of Christ's death, the story of his death that he willingly chose to begin to heal the cosmos, and the resurrection that begins a movement of transformation, of light, and of healing. George MacDonald, the poet, said this incredible quote. He said, "The Son of Man suffered unto death, not that we might not suffer, but that our sufferings might be like his, might have a transformative and redemptive quality to them." So here's the command at the end of the psalm. Put your hope in the Lord. Again, this is an active thing. We're called to hope actively. It means to participate and to believe that God is already at work and we are called to be a part of what he's doing. It's sort of a projection of our imagination where we imagine what the new creation is like and we start living that now. We seek justice, we seek reconciliation, we create beauty and love. Hope is actually a difficult word to define. I remember 4 or 5 years ago sitting with Stacy and Margot Schutt in my office and trying to come up with a definition for hope, for Christian hope. And it took us about half an hour before we landed on something that really made sense to us. It's that hope is a defiant reliance on God keeping his word. His word that all things will be made well. That resurrection follows crucifixion. That summer and spring follow winter. You know, Allison and I are certainly waiting for something right now. Anyone who's been a parent or who's been pregnant knows what this is like. I mean, there's a certain degree of certainty in our waiting because we know a baby is coming. We have no doubt about that. But there is also an element of uncertainty. There may be something going on with the baby that results in a disability, in something that we're not quite sure of. And this does provoke a certain amount of anxiety. And of course, all we can do is just wait and see, and it's passive in that way. But there's also an active part to it. We can be preparing for the baby, not just our home, not just buying clothes or having a hospital bag, but we can be preparing our hearts. You know, we don't just have a blind belief that the baby will be perfect. It may be, it may not be. But we do trust on a deeper level and hope on a deeper level with a conviction that in the end, things will be okay. I know there's other stories of waiting in our congregation too. I think of Mark and Terry. Their families had to wait for their son-in-law to come back from South Africa, I believe, for years. Was it 2 years, something like that? Because of various bureaucratic processes and some red tape, this family was not able to be reunited. And in one sense, it was a passive process. All they could do was just count the days and wait for this man to come home. But in another sense, they could be actively waiting. They could be keeping that relationship alive between father and child, husband and wife, so that when the day finally comes, they are ready. And sure enough, it did finally come. There were some beautiful pictures of that reunion happening. Speaking of travel, let's end there once again. It's a funny place to end because no one is traveling this year. But despite that, we together have all been on a pilgrimage this year. I mean, I feel like as a community, We are ending a certain stage of that pilgrimage right around now. The pandemic has taken us on a pilgrimage of the heart. What do I mean by that? Well, pilgrimages involve hardships, often unexpected. We've certainly experienced that this year. You take 3 steps forward, you take 5 steps back. Pilgrimages are times of forced simplicity. All you can carry is what you can fit on your backpack. Certainly, this has been a time of forced simplicity. Pilgrimages are times where you reevaluate your life's purpose, your identity, your vocation, your calling. And sure enough, that's what we've all been doing, collectively, individually, reevaluating who we are and what our life is really about. You know, I tried to think back at what my personal journey has been like the past 16 months, and I was actually provoked to draw a picture, a little graph. I'm a graph person. And so in the picture that you can see, there are some highs, there are some lows, and they all correspond to events that have happened to me in the past 16 months. And I don't try to read into it too much, or this high is lower than that high, or this, it's qualitative more than a quantitative thing. But this has been my journey. And actually, in your small groups, I'm going to be encouraging you to draw your own graph yourself. Our life circumstances can tell us a certain story about ourselves. And sometimes when we're searching for identity, like we're on a pilgrimage, sometimes when we're searching for a purpose, we can look to the events of our life for clues and cues. In pre-COVID, we had all these meaningful activities. We had these things that told us who we were. We gathered on Sunday mornings because we're part of a community. I had friends over to my house because I'm a well-loved person, and I'm a hospitable host, and I'm well-connected, or I'm talented, and I'm skilled. We had all these things that we told us about ourselves based on what was happening in our lives. But then it was all stripped away. And suddenly the story that we were telling ourselves, it changed. Oh, maybe I'm not a good friend. Maybe I'm not well-connected, skilled, or hospitable. We had to renegotiate who we were. I think one thing that this has perhaps done, the pandemic, is that it's forced us to put our hope in God and God alone, because truthfully, everything else was liable to be stripped away at any minute. We were liable to disappointment at every turn. So I might look at my life story and think that, my life is so random. I'm just subject to circumstances. I'm a victim. I can't control anything. I might as well just give up and not just be passive. But this psalm is a travel song that can help us to retell that story. And in fact, an impression I really was left with when I did this exercise is just how strongly God has been with me in both the highs and the lows. This psalm helps me to reevaluate what my story really is. It helps me to retell my story. And what this psalm tells us, that the Lord is attentive to our cries. He offers healing, forgiveness, so we can love and be loved. He helps us become whole. It reminds us that the morning will always come. And we have a certainty about that. God's unfailing love is being offered to us. And with him is full redemption. That the story of Christ's death and life is a story in which all of our stories find their meaning. So in your small groups, I encourage you to draw a picture of your life. And in fact, I'll share the discussion questions now. Number 1, what are we really waiting for when we wait on God? What is it? Number 2, draw a little map of the basic ups and downs of your last 16 months and share that with each other. And number 3, given the journey you've just described and drawn, where have you seen God at work? Happy travels. Amen.